H.G. Wells in 1934, in a Bournemouth tea room, they decide to go ahead with a film called Whither Mankind, ? The designer, the production designer, or rather designer of settings, is bound to be Vincent Corder, the producer's brother, because he'd worked on Private Life of Henry VIII and in fact had been a production designer since Marius in 1931. H.G. Wells insisted that his son Frank Wells was involved in the model making and sort of helping with the special effects. And having chosen as the director William Cameron Menzies, who was basically a designer rather than a director, you've got another voice in the design process. And Cameron Menzies went back to the silent era, had worked with Valentino, Son of the Sheikh, with Fairbanks, Thief of Baghdad. In fact, Cameron Menzies won the very first Academy Award for production design in 1928. He had directed, or co-directed, 6 films, including the deathless Chandu the Magician with Bela Lugosi, who knew Corder. Co-directing is interesting because people seem to have realized that he wasn't actually very good with actors, but he had a very, very strong visual sense, so he needed someone standing next to him who could actually direct actors. In fact, Lyle Wheeler, who is another production designer in Hollywood, once said of Cameron Menzies, you know, he's so worried about the set when he's directing and where to put the camera and should it be in a hole, where's the ceiling, how do the lights work, that he actually forgets about the actors completely. So this was his first solo effort as a director. So you got his voice. And then, by chance, in summer 1935, on the run from the Nazis, you've got this great Bauhausler from the German Bauhaus art school, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, Hungarian, also knew Corder way back into the 20s. He was a photographer, a filmmaker, a sculptor. He was the sort of visual media tutor at form master at the Bauhaus. So it's a kind of godsend. You've got this great avant-garde designer, and it's a film about what will the future be like. So, you know, let's ask him to help as well. So you've got all these voices, and in a way, it's no wonder the film is such a visual hodgepodge in a way, because all these people are shouting at each other in different ways. Wells had described in some detail in his treatment what he wanted, except he knew nothing about production design, so it's all very rhetorical and big and abstract statements. He sent a memo, a famous memo, quite early on in the production process to the people responsible for visualizing the future. And it's a wonderful example, actually, of Wells's prose. I make no apology for reiterating these principles as emphatically as possible. The first is that in the final scenes, we're presenting a higher phase of civilization than the present, where there is greater wealth, finer order, higher efficiency. Human affairs in that more organized world will not be hurried, they will not be crowded, more leisure, more dignity. All that balderdash one finds in such a film as Fritz Lang's Metropolis about robot workers and ultra skyscrapers, etc., should be cleared out of your minds before you work on this film. As a general rule, you may take it that whatever Lang did in Metropolis is the exact contrary of what we want done here. There we have the guiding rules to observe. But within these limitations and style, I would say to our designers, for God's sake, let yourself go. Well, I mean, he knew exactly what he didn't want. He hadn't got a clue about what he did want was the problem, and thought that the mixture of Cameron Menzies and Vincent Corder and his son Frank and Ned Mann would come up with the answer. He had this B-movie in his head of this vast civilization of the future where everything's going to be less hurried and more dignified. And he was always disappointed when they showed him the reality of making a movie. He constantly found problems with it because his vision was unrealizable. It was rhetoric. It was a politician's speech, really. And, you know, you can't visualize a politician's speech in quite that literal way. And cinema has to be so literal about these things. I think he learnt that, actually, in the hard way, in the process of making things to come. He learnt that, actually, cinema wasn't for him. So Alexander Corder and Wells meet in this Bournemouth tea room over some sardine sandwiches, and there and then, as the legend goes, and it does seem to have happened, on one of the napkins they sign an outline contract. Corder's very, very excited about having got him on board. Wells is going to have his name on the title. They're not allowed to alter a word that he wrote, despite the fact he'd never written a screenplay directly for a feature film before. He's allowed to come onto the set every day and express his views on absolutely everything. And he will be the controlling intelligence. Not the director, not the designer, not the producer. in the contract, the assumption is it is H.G. Wells' vision writ large, and everybody else is going to be his servant, you know, rushing around implementing this vision. It's difficult to imagine today, as a public intellectual, how significant Wells was actually in the mid-30s. He'd moved on from the early science fiction days into what he called these imaginative histories, these vast books with titles like The Work, Wealth and Happiness of Mankind and The Shape of Things to Come, which were kind of predictive history, not quite fantasies, because they are based on, they're rather like sort of Marxist predictions based on tendencies today, although they're not at all Marxist, but they have that kind of feeling to them. What will the world be like if the tendencies of today go on? And mostly they're about how science and technology is going to sort out all our problems, how a form of socialism will actually make life much more dignified, how fascism isn't all that bad because he quite likes central control, and how nationalism, crucially, nationalism will die and you'll have some world council controlling all the nations of the world, and also world councils of scientists, world councils of aviators. That'll be the solution to the petty nationalisms of the 1930s. Now, this is in these huge books. As someone once said, he wrote so quickly that he'd finished the next history in the time it took most people to have finished the last one when they were reading it. He was obsessed with the thought that the film should look not like a utopia, but a realistic interpretation of a future where life gets better. So the detail of that completely obsessed him, and apparently he'd sit on the set and talk about the hemlines of the pleated frocks, you know, in every town in 2036. Or he'd look at the Basra bombers, these great air machines that fly over, dropping the bombs of peace. Are you sure they should have 2 propellers, or should they have 4? And it was driving everyone frantic because, you know, he didn't realize that once the models were ready, once they were shooting, that was it. You can't actually tinker with them and redesign them. He had a view on absolutely everything. So to give you an idea of Wells's treatment and script and how difficult it was to visualize, I just want to read you from the treatment a little bit about the rebuilding of every town. This is Wells's instructions to Cameron Menzies, to Vincent Corder, to Ned Mann, the special effects man, and to his son Frank for the model builders, building those little sort of vacuum cleaners that suck out the essence of the mountain. This is what he writes. A triumphant musical sequence, a sequence of creative work and power, flashes to give a crescendo of strenuous creative activity, men working in laboratories. This will have to be drawn from contemporary stuff, but the stuff must be futurized by putting unfamiliar machines in the air, projecting giant machines, making great discs and curved forms, swing and rotate enigmatically. How do you swing enigmatically? Before the spectator, emphasized by banners, research, invention, world planning, scientific control. There is a progressive improvement in the neatness and vigor of the machinery as the series goes through. Now, imagine receiving that script. How on earth do you visualize research, world planning, and so on? It's great, it's inspiring, it's rhetorically, it's marvelous, but as a guide to the designers, it's a non-starter. They had a real problem. When the team were discussing, I call it a team, but when Wells was discussing the future of every town in 2036, they speculated about contemporary artists who might be able to help them. And the first that was approached was Fernand Léger. He had, in fact, designed part of a feature film called L'Inhumaine, made in 1922-23, where he designed a laboratory of the future with all revolving discs and hanging things and so on. And they thought, well, you know, there's not much of a step from that to every town. And he worked on it for about a month. I mean, a great artist. Corder knew him. And it came back, and Wells thought, no, it looks too much like a painted backdrop, a kinetic backdrop, which actually the laboratory in L'Inhumaine does look like a kinetic backdrop. It looks like a sort of 3D version of a Léger painting. So no, sorry, Léger's out. The letter hasn't survived, but the idea of writing to Fernand Léger saying, I mean, you know, this great, great artist, I know you've worked on this for a month, but actually it's a bit cheesy. Sorry, mate. That's what they did. Then after Léger, they thought, well, let's try an architect rather than a fine artist. And Corbusier had published in the early 20s his fantasy city of the future, with skyscrapers of several hundred stories and aeroplanes flying around below the roofline. It's obligatory in visions of the future in the 1920s. It also published various photographic books on transport, on air travel and locomotive travel, where he juxtaposed photographs of the present with speculations about the future. So maybe he'd be the man for every town. And he thought that, having seen, one hopes, a translated script, I don't know whether it was or not, it was much too preachy, that the attitudes that people espoused in the world of the future were much too old-fashioned. And besides, he thought the world was going to go upwards. You weren't going to build the modern city inside a hillside and go downwards. So, no, thank you very much. It doesn't fit any of my principles of architecture. So that didn't work either. Vincent Corder, having been rejected by Léger and Corbusier, then steeps himself in avant-garde magazines of the time. Architectural magazines, design magazines, magazines about what the Europeans call modernism, what the Americans call the international style. And he picks up on lots of ideas, obviously Corbusier and how that finds its way into the architecture. But Norman Bel Geddes, the American designer, wrote a book called Horizons, 1933, which has a section on predictions of the future of aviation. And there's an airliner there with a V-wing, which isn't identical to the Basra bombers in the film, but it's based on an idea by Bel Geddes. Also there is his idea of an amphitheatre of the future, how theatre will be without a proscenium arch, with an open relationship between performers and audience. And there's a sense of that, I think, in the city centre of every town in 2036. It's like one huge amphitheatre. What happens in the end is that Laszlo Moholy-Nagy works on the famous sequence of the rebuilding of every town in 1936. And amazingly, 4 shots from this turned up in 1975 in a rusting can of film at Denham for a documentary that was being made about Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. And it shows exactly what he was up to. You've got see-through plastic with perforations, with light going through it, like sculpture. You've got steel skeletons with hanging plastic skyscrapers going past you. You've got revolving see-through cones. You've got sort of layered terraces of a modern high-rise building, which is based on Mies van der Rohe's concept of 1922 for a glass skyscraper that was never built. And they look marvelous. I mean, as an abstract film, you think, well, this is great. As an artist film, how they would have used that in the actual finished film, I don't know, because they didn't. Basically, where Moholy-Nagy's contribution is concerned, they used 90 seconds worth. Some flashing lights, some tubes with mercury squirting in them, a diver standing there and waving, seen through corrugated glass, some huge machines with tiny technicians standing next to them. You know, that was Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, but basically it was designed by Vincent Corder. The vision of the future gets some things very right. He was always presented as a prophet, Wells. Intelligent fabrics, nuclear power, the caring about the above-ground environment. That famous scene of the center of every town, which actually looks like one of those super hotels built in America in the 1960s, was very prophetic. This sort of spinal cord with a rib cage of terraces, with trees actually planted on the terraces, with a transparent elevator going up, is just like one of those super hotels built by Portman in the late 60s in America. The space gown is very, very interesting. I mean, look at Fritz Lang's Woman in the Moon, 1929, where you've got an explosion-propelled rocket. And in fact, Werner von Braun, as a very young man, was a sort of informal advisor on Woman in the Moon. So the idea of rocket power, which turned into the V2s, which turned into the modern space race, is there in Woman in the Moon. So they knew in 1929 that that's the way rockets were going to go. But Wells insisted in the treatment and in the script, this should be a gun that you point towards the moon and fire it. And it should be a sort of rifle bolt principle, that the gun sort of pulls back with these gigantic bolts, click, and then whoosh, and you fire it towards the moon. And he insisted on this because he thought it was symbolic of how guns could be used for positive scientific ends. So in the early period, you've got the anti-aircraft guns on the ground, using roughly the same principle, and you finish with the giant space gun, only this time it's in the interests of science. Great idea as a sort of philosophy, but unfortunately, as the Journal of the British Interplanetary Society, to which we all subscribe, wrote immediately afterwards, the impact on the astronauts would have been they'd have been turned into raspberry jam. I mean, you know, this thing pulls back, whoomph, and they'd have just been completely collapsed. So it didn't work at all, except at the symbolic level. Interestingly, when the publicists started designing the posters for Things to Come, they were obviously a little bit embarrassed about the space gun. So they put onto the poster a rocket with fire coming out of the back, as if it's a woman in the moon style rocket. The furniture in Things to Come is directly based on the work of a man called Oliver Hill, who was a designer who exhibited in 1933 in a big exhibition of British design, a glass room, a glass bed, glass table, glass chairs. And in fact, it was so kind of modern that controversially he wanted a nude woman to be lying on the glass bed as a sort of publicity stunt. And someone said, actually, it'll shatter. So it's not an awfully good idea, so it didn't happen. But they didn't actually make the props of glass. They made it of a modern display plastic, which was very fashionable in the 1930s. It's called rhodoid. And these rhodoid see-through plastic display pieces were moulded as chairs, tables, and so on. So the future is glass. And some of the reviewers picked up on this and said, well, so in 2036, the Oliver Hill revival will be in full swing, no question. But it was, again, this idea of the transparent city.
What a funny place New York was. All sticking up and full of windows.
They built houses like that in the old days.
Why?
They'd no light inside their cities as we have, so they had to stick them up into the daylight.
That discussion about New York in the film, that so much of modern architecture is to keep light out. Tiny windows, big block construction, and all that lovely light that you could live with. Why is it that buildings keep so much light on? Well, the idea of furniture as see-through and light and transparent was very much part of that philosophy, I think. So the interior design is actually a very interesting glimpse of what in 1936 the future would hold. The moment the film comes out, there's a battle royal going on in British architecture between early modernism and the forces of traditionalism. Take the Bauhauslers, you know, they come over to London in 1935 when the Bauhaus gets closed by the Nazis. And these eggheads from Germany are treated with great suspicion. Nobody knows what on earth to do with them. Gropius gets involved in one house and actually advises Korda on the layout of the studios at Denham. Lubetkin designs the penguin pond at London Zoo. Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, this great sculptor and photographer, does window displays at Simpson's department store in Piccadilly. I mean, nobody knew what to do with these people. How do you absorb them into the architectural mainstream? Because the world isn't ready for modernism. You could argue Britain isn't awfully ready for modernism now, but it certainly wasn't in 1936. So it's a fantastically interesting moment architecturally for this film to come out. And it is unreconstructed modernism, you know, the last third of the film. So the architectural press does breathe a sort of collective sigh of relief. Oh, God, we've been saying this for ages. At last, here's a mainstream film that's putting over these ideas. That's a real plus, I think. And, you know, in the context of 1936, rather important. Otherwise, you know, half-timbered architecture, Georgian architecture, Tudor-Beethoven architecture, country house architecture, retrospective regret, you know, that sort of architecture actually dominates. And then, when the film comes out, it's very interesting how the architectural press reacts to it. One of the articles says, this will introduce modernism to the public. Nobody had heard of Le Corbusier in England, basically, in 1936, apart from a few architects living in North London. No one knew that it was the brand, the name, but the ideas of garden cities, other light sources, dispersed cities, hygienic cities, all those thoughts that came out of modernism are actually put into the bloodstream by Things to Come, says these, which is interesting. Others are more cynical and say, you know, why are they wearing bathing suits that look as though they're 1936, although it's supposed to be... Is it the 1936 revival in 100 years' time? Rather sort of cynical reaction to that.
We've shirked and lived in vain. We must go now.
The thing about the whole film, and people get this wrong about science fiction, it isn't saying the future will necessarily be like this. It's saying taking tendencies of 1936 and extrapolating from them and being critical about the present and making comments about the present and talking about philosophies that are very different from the present in order for us to actually question the status quo. That's what the film's about 1936, you know, and all science fiction is about the year that it's written. It's not about the future, really. But in the process of extrapolating to make these critical or satirical or parodic comments, it actually makes certain predictions, some of which come true. Looking back on things to come, firstly, I think it's an extremely rare example of a positive image of the future. When you think about it, nearly all science fiction films are dystopic, you know, it's going to get nastier. They spend a fortune in this technological medium telling us that technology is bad for us, basically. Aliens are going to get us, society's going to turn nasty, and asteroids are going to hit us. You know, it's all going to end in tears. So that's one thing, very positive.
Oh, God, is there never to be any age of happiness? Is there never to be any rest?
Rest enough for the individual man. Too much and too soon, and we call it death. But for man, no rest and no ending. He must go on, conquest beyond conquest.
What matters is that Wells was trying, in a very painfully serious way, to talk about philosophy. And most science fiction films are shoot-em-ups with ray guns and people in zipper suits, and it's Ming the Merciless, it's Darth Vader, it's basically a Western B-movie set in space. He was trying for something much more ambitious, which is how will people think, what will philosophies be like, what will the mentalities, the structures of feeling be like in 100 years' time if you take his predictive histories as a guide. And that's a very ambitious thing to attempt. I actually don't know of any other science fiction film. I mean, some of the Russian ones sort of touch on this, but I don't know of any science fiction film that tries to be so serious about predicting the philosophy of the future. Now, it makes it leaden, it makes it difficult, it makes it very wordy. Corbusier was right, it is very preachy, but you've got to give him full marks for ambition. He thought he could put over quite deep thinking about the future and the tendencies of the present in film form. He discovered he couldn't, and it was very sad. In film history terms, I think it put Hollywood off serious science fiction for a generation. And as I've written, I think it's the great masthead film about modernism in architecture and design in the way that Blade Runner in the early 80s is the great masthead film about the city centre in the era of postmodernism. And that's important.